Hello again, Kingsway. Our worship text for today is found in John chapter 21, verses 15 through 25. Hear now these words of the evangelist John. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time Jesus said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" And Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We're back in the final chapter of John's Gospel this week to conclude our exploration of the transformational calling we have received from the risen Christ, first articulated to the disciples on Easter evening. "As the Father has sent me, so I send you." It's a strong affirmation as well as a significant commission to go forth from Jesus in the name of Jesus, as Jesus has gone forth from the Father in the name of the Father. That's huge. But what does it mean exactly, and what are the implications for us as disciples in our day and time? The stories of John 21 not only conclude John's narrative, but also help us at least begin to understand what Jesus has accomplished and what our role in continuing his mission is. It's a commission that begins, as we saw last week, with Jesus confronting Peter with his doubt, his denial, his faithlessness, and then transforming it with grace and love into something nourishing for him and for others. That's the symbolism of the charcoal fire over which Jesus prepares a breakfast of fish and bread. This commission also flows from Jesus' expansion of divine agency within the world in the wake of his resurrection. Jesus doesn't just serve the disciples breakfast. He invites them, and he, by extension, invites us to be partners, to be participants. The disciples bring some of the fish they have caught to contribute to the breakfast. Yes, Jesus instructed them where they should cast their net, but the disciples did the catching and the hauling of the fish onto shore. This is valuable and important context for where we pick up the story in verse 15 with a famous exchange between Jesus and Peter that all too often is read and interpreted apart from this larger context. which is that Jesus feeds Peter, then asks Peter to feed others. A lot has been made about the different words for love used in this passage and the difference between sheep and lambs. Those observations are important. One of the beautiful things about reading the fourth gospel is that John is so specific and intentional in the way he uses language. But we also have to take care not to miss the bigger picture John is depicting, the core message he's driving home. Jesus is asking Peter to be a shepherd, to do what Jesus himself has done and what he will continue to do as the good shepherd. One of the perennial questions about this episode is, why does Jesus repeat himself 3 times? Peter gets annoyed by it, in fact. 3 is a nice Trinitarian number, of course, but I think there is a practical as well as a symbolic explanation. What Jesus is asking is not an easy request. Peter is too quick to answer without fully grasping all that yes entails. Yes, Lord, I love you. Then feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. This feeding, this following the example of Jesus is what comes next. When these disciples were last together with Jesus around a meal, Jesus said to them, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And the specific new commandment Jesus gave to Peter and the rest on that night was to love one another as I have loved you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you, is the commission that mirrors that commandment, the commission that flows from it. As I have loved, so love each other. And what kind of love is that? It's a sacrificial, tenacious, all-in kind of love. It's not just a spiritual, philosophical kind of love. It's holistic and multifaceted, not unlike the meals that Jesus has served. When Jesus fed the disciples breakfast, he offered them fish and bread that recalls the dinner he fed to the 5,000 in the countryside. So this breakfast is more than physical food. It means something more, but it is physical food. It is actual sustenance, and it's plentiful, abundant sustenance. The crowd gathered in the countryside, ate until they had their fill, and there was food left over, as did the disciples gathered around Jesus' charcoal fire here on the beach. The same holds true for the Lord's Supper, which we will share together in just a little while. It's more than bread and drink, but it is bread and drink. Unfortunately, the way we've come to celebrate communion dilutes its tangible power because we've reduced it to a morsel of bread and a sip of juice. In the early church, however, communion was connected to a full meal, a feast even, a physical reminder of the abundance we find and possess in Christ, as well as a symbolic reminder of the sacrifice Christ made for us. Both reminders are important because both of these gospel realities form the foundation from which we embrace and engage our Christ-given commission to go and feed others as we have been fed, to go and love as we have been loved, a love that motivated Christ to give of himself fully. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Now, what that going and loving looks like for each of us as churches and as individuals can be different. That's the second part of this second half of John 21. Peter's calling and the beloved disciples lie along different paths and will lead them to different places, different experiences, even different outcomes. The same is true for each of us. How Jesus calls me to live out this commission is going to look different than how he calls you to live out this commission, given who I am and who you are. We possess different gifts, different resources, we inhabit different bodies, we hail from and occupy different places and spaces. But no matter those differences, the commission remains the same for you and me and all of us, to love as Jesus loved, to go as Jesus went. That doesn't mean we are or ever could be Jesus. We can't be. As obvious as that seems, it is a line we can cross. Father James Martin says it's important for us to remember that there are two parts to the good news of the gospel. The first is that there is a Messiah. The second is that the Messiah isn't you. In our desire to follow Jesus, we have to be careful we don't develop a messianic complex to see ourselves as the means to anyone's salvation, including our own. Only Jesus saves. Sharing a single common commission does mean that our role, our tasks, no matter who we are or where we are or what we are, is to be witnesses to Christ's saving love and grace. And we testify to Christ's love and grace by living lives grounded in and transformed by Christ's love and grace. A sacrificial love and an abounding grace, which means we are oriented, guided, and motivated by a larger purpose than our own success and fulfillment as individuals and as a congregation. And we use a different set of standards to measure our progress and accomplishment. To be servants of all, not lords over anyone. To love God with our whole selves and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Dietrich Bonhoeffer summarized it this way: the church is the church only when it exists for others, not dominating, but helping and serving. That's how we not only tell people, but show people of every stripe what it means to live for Christ, to exist for others. The challenge is figuring out what that looks like for us, whether we're Peter or John or Pat or Juliet. What does loving as Jesus loved, going as Jesus went, look like for you, in your context, in your circles, in your neighborhood? Whatever it is, what John 21 shows us is that it has to be tangible as well as spiritual, substantive as well as symbolic. And that's always the rub. Following Jesus moves us beyond the idea of loving our neighbors as ourselves and into the act of actually doing it. That love can and should take different forms for each of us, but it must involve care and concern for the well-being of others beyond our own personal or self-interest, particularly for the vulnerable and the marginalized, folks like the ones following Jesus through the countryside, the people he fed and healed and restored to community. Bonhoeffer's quote about the church only being the church when it exists for others actually includes a starting suggestion: give everything you have away to the poor. A suggestion he got, of course, straight from Jesus in the other three Gospels that we'll revisit starting next week. Now, I'm not filling that in to suggest that we sell our building or anything quite so drastic as that, at least not on the spur of the moment. The agenda for today's business meeting is already set. But it should be a reminder that love, especially Jesus' love, pushes us further. It isn't just love, it's sacrificial love. It isn't just grace, it's amazing grace. How concerned are we really for the poor and the marginalized, the vulnerable in our city, in our society? What's it motivating to do for our neighbors, tangibly, beyond voicing the spiritual sentiment of Jesus' commandment to love them as we love ourselves? How are we bearing witness to Jesus in our answer to that question? That's the rub. The rub for all of us to ponder as Jesus now once again invites us to be both guests and participants around his abundant table. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. That's our affirmation and our commission. Straight, and may it grow to become our conviction, our passion, and our purpose as well, as Jesus continues to guide and provide for us around his table, here and wherever we find ourselves. Thanks be to God for the affirmation and the commission.